Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and this week we are continuing our theme week with 80s adventure kids teams, and today we are doing the 1985 film, The Goonies. Here is your trivia question for today. What does Chunk offer to share with Sloth when they first meet? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So our film starts off with four best friends, Mikey, Mouth, Data, and Chunk, who all live in an area of Oregon known as the Goondocks, which is unfortunately soon going to be sold out from all of their families. So they decide that they have to have one last adventure. So the boys all sneak up to the attic where they look through Mikey and Brand's father's stuff that he brought back from the museum that he works at. It's here where they discover a map that might lead to a pirate's treasure that belonged to a captain known as One-Eyed Willie. Mikey's older brother Brand decides that the boys cannot run off on this adventure as he was left in charge. So the boys decide to get him tied up and go searching for the treasure anyway. Bran eventually does get free and then goes to find the boys. While looking for them, he does run into two of his friends from school, Andy and Steph, who decide to join him. So once all the kids get together, they finally decide that taking this adventure on as a team is what would be best. Now, the group will have quite a bit to contend with, including quite a few booby traps, and unfortunately, a family of criminals called the Fratellis that have discovered what the kids are after and are more than willing to take them out to get it. So, which group will make it to One-Eyed Willie's treasure first? This movie was directed by Richard Donner, who also managed to slip in a cameo as the sheriff. Also, he managed to walk away from the production with the actual One-Eyed Willie's skull and a model of the pirate ship. Sean Astin was actually allowed to keep the map, although unfortunately several years later, his mother found it and thought it was just a crinkled up piece of paper and threw it out. The movie was written by Chris Columbus and Steven Spielberg. Now, Columbus is actually the one who came up with the initial idea, as when he was a child growing up in Ohio, he would actually explore abandoned coal mines during the summer. The movie takes place in and was largely filmed in Astoria, Oregon, but some of it was also filmed in California, especially for the cave system, which was all faked and made in a studio. Did you happen to notice that all of the Goonies go by nicknames, either a shortened version of their name or something about them? Michael Walsh, Mikey. Brandon Walsh, Brand. Clark Devereaux, Mouth. Richard Wong, Data. Lawrence Cohen, Chunk. Andrea Teresa Carmichael, Andy. Stephanie Steinbrenner, Steph. And even Sloth, whose real name was Lotney Fratelli. So aside from the fact that this movie was both Sean Astin and Josh Brolin's feature film debut, they also have something else interesting in common. Both of them have a famous parent and a famous step-parent. Sean Astin's mother is Patty Duke, and his stepfather was John Astin. Josh Brolin's father was James Brolin, and his stepmother is Barbara Streisand. Corey Feldman wasn't the only Corey who went out for the role of Mouth. Corey Haim also did, and this was the first time the two Coreys had met, but they wouldn't become friends until Lost Boys in 1987. Ke Huy Quan, who played Data, would eventually one day appear in the Loki series for Marvel as the character of Ouroboros. Did you happen to notice, though, that he is also wearing a very similar utility belt to his character of Data? Ke Huy Quan also has an entertainment lawyer, Jeff Cohen. Do you recognize that name? Well, he just so happens to play Chunk in this movie. Jeff Cohen actually hated doing the Truffle Shuffle, and that's mainly due to the fact that he was still just getting over chicken pox, and some of the pox were still there. The arcade game that Chunk is playing at the beginning of the film is Cliffhanger. This film was Carrie Green's first feature film debut. Also, she almost got beat up for the character of Andy by Heather Langenkamp. Did you happen to know that Martha Plimpton's father is Keith Carradine, which means that her father and her uncles are the famous Carradine brothers? The actor who played Sloth, John Matuzak, originally was part of the Oakland Raiders at one point, which is why Sloth actually wears an Oakland Raiders t-shirt. Also, when Sloth rips off one shirt to reveal the Superman shirt, you can clearly hear the John Williams Superman theme from the film, which is another movie that Richard Donner directed. The movie that Sloth is watching is Captain Blood starring Errol Flynn from 1935. When Sloth says, "Hey you guys," he's actually copying something he heard from the television series The Electric Company, which is a catchphrase that Rita Moreno would constantly say. The Fratellis are actually based off an early 20th century legend of Kate Barker, also known as Ma Barker, and her boys. Apparently, Robert Davi and Joe Pantoliano did not get along at all during production. Davi, by the way, is a trained opera singer and came up with the idea of having his character sing at times. The pirate ship in the film is called the Inferno, and it was not actually shown to the cast until that scene, so that the look of surprise was genuine. Also, it was entirely real. After the film was wrapped, the ship was offered to anyone who would take it, but no one wanted it, so it was scrapped. At the end of the film, Data actually mentions the octopus was very scary. They actually did create and design an octopus, and there was a full scene filmed for it, but it did not end up in the final version of the movie. Speaking about other things that don't show up in the movie, in the novelization, it confirms that Chunk's parents do actually in fact adopt Sloth. They actually even give him a bat mitzvah. Also in the novel, they have to tickle a skeleton's elbow to show them the way to go. And finally, one last thing that's in the novel, Mikey apparently finds an inhaler of some sort next to One-Eyed Willie, which makes him believe that he is the reincarnation of the pirate. Here's something else that's interesting. The Goonies and the Gremlins might exist in the same universe. When Chunk calls the cops, the officer says, "This is like the prank about the creatures that multiply when you throw water on them." And Chris Columbus did in fact write the stories for both films, and Steven Spielberg did produce both of them. Now, we also can't talk about the Goonies without also talking about Cyndi Lauper's song, Goonies Are Good Enough, and of course the music video. In the music video, most of the cast did in fact come back for it. There was also a quick cameo by Spielberg, and for some reason, a bunch of WWF wrestlers. Now, nothing has ever been confirmed, but for years now, there's always been talk about a Goonies 2 or just a remake. So when it comes to the film The Goonies, I love this movie. It's absolutely one of my favorites from the 80s. But rewatching it all of these years later, I do have to say there are some parts of it that just don't work all that well. So even though it hurts a little to say, I think I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 5. And if you're like me and you do love this movie, here's some other movies I recommend checking out: Monster Squad, Stand By Me, Super 8, and E.T. Now, if you can't get enough of Goonies, you do have some options, possibly. For instance, there was actually a Goonies video game back on the Commodore 64, Atari, and some other systems. Goonies 2 came out on the NES, and LEGO Dimensions did do a Goonies pack. There are also quite a few board games, and even a few comic book series as well. Now, time for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode. What does Chunk offer to share with Sloth when they first meet? He offers him a candy bar, and more specifically, a Baby Ruth. Baby? Ruth? I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.